in South Africa, I learned that some round metallic objects had been found in a mine there. And what was really interesting about them is some of them were perfectly spherical, and around their equators, there were parallel grooves. They looked like something that had to be manufactured somehow, not like something natural. And the problem is they were found in a mine in mineral deposits about 2.8 billion, not million, but billion years old.
Wow. Welcome to Far Out with Faust, everybody. I am Faust Chicho, and today I'm talking to pioneering archaeologist Michael Cremo. Michael's going to share with us some mind-blowing evidence that calls into question everything we've been told about our human history here on Earth. We're going to talk about Mr. Charles Darwin and his theories and why most people have forgotten that it's a theory. We're going to delve into the undisputed fossil evidence showing that human species coexisted with each other millions of years ago, and how this is slowly but surely chipping away at the dogma of conventional evolutionary theory. Finally and thankfully. Hang on to your seats because we're also going far out, man. This is the man who authored the book Forbidden Archeology, among others. And this thing reads like a massive testament. It is all evidence. But stay tuned, skeptics, because Michael backs up what he's saying with literally hard evidence. And we're going to explain why you haven't heard about some of these incredible findings in any of your mainstream media books or academic textbooks. Michael, thank you so much for beaming in. We appreciate you having you on.
Good to be with you and all your listeners.
Thank you. So let's dive right in, my friend. Well, I guess first of all, give everybody kind of, if you could, a brief rundown of your credentials as a scientist, and then we'll get into some of the conventional accepted kind of theory and what it says.
My perspective is informed by my encounter with the spiritual tradition of ancient India, which is based on the Vedic writings, and the Vedic histories tell of human populations existing on Earth millions of years ago, which is something quite different from what modern science tells us about the origin of our species. They would say humans like us appeared less than 300,000 years ago on this planet. And before that, there were no human beings like us. So and this is something that's found not just in the Vedic culture of ancient India, but many of the ancient wisdom traditions have this idea of a very long human presence on this planet. So I decided, well, is there perhaps some factual basis for this, or is this just some mythology that was invented by the authors of these different scriptures? So that's what got me looking into the history of archaeology. And I looked beyond the evidence that you see in the current textbooks, because there you'll find only the evidence that supports the now dominant paradigms or theories. So I decided, let me look beyond that. Let me go back to the original scientific reports of the past couple of centuries and see what's there. And what I found was really quite amazing. I found that over the years, many archaeologists and geologists, other scientists who are digging into the earth, have found human bones, human artifacts, human footprints that go back much further than 300,000 years, in some cases, many millions of years. So I had to ask myself, well, if this evidence is there in the original scientific reports, why isn't it in the textbooks?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because of a process of knowledge filtration. So in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, I laid all this out, giving the exact references, the exact sources
Yes, you did. Yeah.
of all this. And, even those who disagree with me, they say, well, you have to admire the scholarship, the detail to which
Mm-hmm.
he's gone. And basically, I present both sides of the story, in each case, what's favorable to accepting the evidence and what the possible objections or real objections could be,
Right.
and let the reader make up his or her own mind about it. So
Right.
I think a lot of them appreciated that aspect of things, because the usual critique of the current theories of human evolution is usually
One
kind of
side or the other, right?
fanatical,
Yeah.
in a sense, and it I mean, one of the scholars who reviewed Forbidden Archaeology in a professional scientific journal, peer-reviewed scientific journal, said, "Well, this is something we've never really seen before. And this is different than the usual kind of anti-Darwin trend
Right.
that we get. This guy has done his research. It's well written. He presents a reasonable case. We may
Yeah.
have to spend some time countering what he says, but so I think because of that, I've been able to make a case for these things in meetings of the World Archaeological Congress, the European Association of Archaeologists, other scientific conferences and institutions and universities, as I said, and also a lot of just ordinary people find these things fascinating. So
yeah, well, it's a big point of interest, and I think I mean, I think a lot of people think about it, but it's, once you close the book on something, then I in my opinion, the kind of you start to lose a growing field of interest. It's almost like I remember they said this about physics at one point. They were like, we know everything there is to know. And everyone was like, actually, they didn't know much at all, but they thought they did. And I feel like archaeology falls into this same kind of category. They want to close the book on it, but it's impossible to close the book on it, because the truth is there's still so much that is yet to be, truly discovered, and also kind of admitted into what we do know. And I know no one knows that as well as you do, but yeah. So I understand, from doing my homework on you, that you aren't, a official credentialed, quote, scientist, but in truth, your credentials are vast, and your body of work is even bigger than probably most archaeologists walking around the planet. So I just wanted to put that out there. We're definitely going to get into how you embarked on this incredible body of work, and all the spiritual traditions that kind of sent you on this search, which is I find just as fascinating as what you've discovered. But it's funny, Michael, Darwin keeps coming up in my conversations for one reason or another, and I have a problem with what they've done with Darwin's theories, and because they've taken it and they've made it, first of all, dogmatic, and they've conditioned people to, receive anything that goes against this kind of thinking with the same kind of fervor that you would have, in a religious kind of setting. And also, I don't agree with how limited it is and what it justifies about quote nature, particularly human nature. And I, recently found out a lot of things about Darwin that I was like, well, that makes more sense. who was propping him up and taking him what he was looking at and changing it for their own benefit and justification. But you probably have learned a lot about it and thought about it even more. What do you think? Why are people so reluctant to change in spite of the preponderant, this incredible amount of evidence that has come to be directly in the face of Darwinian theory?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Some years ago, I was giving a lecture about forbidden archaeology, and the topic of Darwin came up. And during the question session, somebody said, Michael, maybe you're a reincarnation of Charles Darwin, and you've had to come back to correct your mistake. So I kind of laughed at it too a little bit, kind of in the same way that you just, but then I started thinking about it. Maybe that's why I've got to give all these lectures and write these books.
Yeah.
But Darwin himself, if you read his at least the first edition of the Origin of Species, he's pretty reasonable. He kind of admits the shortcomings of his theory, and he points out that he really hasn't proved anything, and he's very gentlemanly in the way he presents things. But as you said, some of his followers at the time, his colleagues or compatriots, like Thomas Huxley and people like that, they had another agenda, which was, Darwin was kind of like a country gentleman.
Yeah.
He didn't consider himself to be a professional scientist. And that was his source of income, and that was his whole reason for being. He was a country gentleman, from the aristocracy, and had free time and the luxury and ability to contemplate some of these questions. But you have people like Thomas Huxley and others. They called themselves the X Club. And they were kind of a different sort of person. The academic world had been changing, and now there were professional scientists who did it for a living, and they had positions in universities and different institutions and things, and it became more of a political and ideological type of question, because they were very committed to materialism and reductionism, and it became a whole ideology, or almost like you could say, as you said, a religion of a very fanatical and fundamentalist type. So I think that has something to do with it.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely, it does. And I think that I obviously not many people learn about the fact that Darwin had made, an initial edition, which said a lot of things that I think were, as you pointed out, were very reasonable. And there was a certain humility in his observations, which are clear in his writing. And then as you go to the second edition, and then particularly the third edition, you start to see some of the wording change and become more specific in ways that is, when you look at it through the lens of today, is a little shocking. I think, that he went from one thing to the next, and using words like superior and race, and you just start to see kind of the seeds of what would become a different way of looking at and believing the world is. And I think that needs to come to the forefront in our society if we're going to get over it, if we're going to start to allow, for knowledge in all its forms, and not say, because that is a very specific, I know what's right and what's best for people, and you don't. And, that's a very authoritarian, let's call it fascist way of looking at the world. And that implies one superior person or race over another. And that's what's in his kind of third edition. I mean, am I getting that wrong? Does that sound like what you?
I think you've hit on something, and it has to do with who has the authority to speak about these things and say what the truth is in society. And historians of science and philosophers of science, people who study how science operates and what its intellectual foundations are and things like that, many of them have kind of concluded that what you wind up with is in the world of science, it's divided into different disciplines, physics, biology, chemistry, psychology. So they stake out a domain and say, okay, we're the experts in this domain, and we are the ones who are qualified to say what's true and what isn't. And who chooses the experts? Who decides who's the expert? We do.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to convince everyone that's the only people you should believe.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's kind of what some philosophers of science have called a cognitive authoritarianism. Mm. Like, we are the ones, you're not qualified to speak about this. You haven't gone through our vetting system. But even within those disciplines, there's a problem, because people do come up with different ideas. And it becomes a question, how is the main consensus group, the dominant group within that discipline, going to deal with those minorities within their community who have different ideas? Like in terms of geology, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a German geologist named Wegener, and he had this idea of continental drift. And all the mainstream geologists just rejected it. That's crazy, but now, a century later, it's the dominant idea, plate tectonics, continents, Pangaea, breaking up into different fragments that are today's continents, which are also, according to that theory, so So it becomes like a problem for them. So
Yeah.
so I would say that there are alternatives in the scientific world, but at the present moment, they're being, uh, what can I say, suppressed, or
Yeah. Yeah.
controlled, or marginalized, or whatever.
Debunked, quote, debunked. That's a very,
Yeah,
very popular kind of word in pop culture today. It's like, oh, it's been debunked.
yeah,
You know, you find what you're looking for. So people who go and they look for, you know, and they literally type in the words debunked, and of course that's what they find, because they have a ready-made search results for people who are looking for these things. And it's unfortunate that the curiosity, you know, they've conditioned people to be curious to confirm their bias, but the problem is people don't realize that they've been, you know, conditioned to have a bias. So you have a kind of a loop that they've gotten away with, and I'm sure they're very happy about in a lot of ways. That happens with people, you know, only kind of going and confirming what they're hoping to confirm, that it's that they don't have to change anything about what they've been taught or believe. It's unfortunate.
yeah. Well, I think the one thing that's helpful today is, at least temporarily, there's alternative ways of communicating. I mean, these doubts about uh, the scientists and the positions that they take, it, 30 or 40 years ago, it used to be pretty much confined to the academic world. The philosophers of science and the historians of science, like Thomas Kuhn and others, were pointing out to other scholars. Yeah, today's dominant groups in science, they're presenting themselves like high priests, and whatever they say has to be accepted. But actually, they're just like they're humans just like anybody else. And they have their biases and prejudices, and that filters into their work and influences them. And we got to take them down a notch. But what happened, during the intervening years, is this attitude, this questioning attitude to people who present themselves as authorities and are trying to have their ideas accepted by everyone. It's kind of, the skepticism about that has become more general.
Yeah.
Maybe because of the changes in communication.
Yeah.
Like it used to be, I mean, a long time ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there were 3 television networks.
Yeah.
And it was sort of easier to control the channels of communication and education.
Yeah.
But now, at least temporarily, there's a degree of freedom where ideas can circulate outside,
Right.
a few narrow channels that can be easily controlled. But then we have to watch out for different kinds of censorship.
It's becoming rampant. I want to say again, I feel like we're, take 2 steps forward, 3 steps back in our society. I remember they used to burn. I mean, I wasn't alive for it, but you'd see pictures, and they used to have big book burning parties, right? I mean, kind of books were they burning? I mean, they've been torching knowledge for a long time. I know there was a big library in Alexandria that got burned. Now, why did they do that? What, you know what I mean? Like, what is with people torching? There's something about the control mechanisms in place that they want to torch these things.
Yeah, well, there are different kinds of power in the world. There's political power, there's economic power, there's military power. There's also intellectual power, which is very subtle power, but it's very powerful, in many ways more powerful than military, economic, and other types of power, because those that possess it have the ability to define our sense of identity. And if you can control a person's sense of identity, what they feel that they are, you've automatically kind of controlled their values, their goals,
their behavior,
their behavior. Yes. For example, if I think I'm an American man, well, that's how I behave.
Right.
That's my identity.
Yeah.
Now, how this operates in the scientific world is through the Darwinian theory of evolution and other ideas that they define us, they educate us in the idea that basically we're machines made of molecules in competition with each other individually and collectively for survival. And that's who we are and what we are. And if that vision is kept intact, then people act in certain ways. Their goals, their values become very materialistic. They think that to produce and consume more and more material things in competition with other groups trying to do the same thing is the main purpose of human life. And all of that activity generates wealth, which flows in, how can we say, in certain ways to benefit certain classes of people who benefit from
that's right, the same ones. That's
and so you get a whole set of political, cultural, financial, religious institutions, educational institutions that are all based on that. And I think that's where this sense of conformity and control
absolutely,
that's the basis of it. Now, if people had a different sense of identity, like I'm not a machine made of molecules. I'm a being of pure consciousness, and we're all related on that platform. And we can
we are one human family.
We don't have to divide ourselves up into so many competing groups, struggling for control of the material resources on this planet and using them in an unsustainable way that's kind of poisoning the land, poisoning the air, poisoning the water. We can figure things out, how to satisfy our material needs in the most simple, natural, efficient, and fair way possible, while putting most of our human energy into developing the resource of consciousness. That would be an entirely different kind of civilization.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. It would be there would be a lot less strife and struggle, and this notion that suffering is part of existence would, it would have to take a back seat instead of the front seat that it's had.
So a lot of people don't want to see that happen.
I know.
Which I
talk
think
about
is
those people
why there is such resistance to, if you start talking about things like reincarnation or consciousness surviving beyond the brain, beyond the body, you start talking about maybe there's some cosmic intelligence or something behind everything. It's not all just matter combining in its own ways. That that is why I think there is so much resistance to things like that from the scientific and educational establishment, because they realize that if those ideas become dominant, then they're finished.
Right. No, what? Because it's a material. They've been indoctrinated, and so and I was talking about this with I'm sure you've heard of David Icke.
David Icke, yeah.
Yeah, we were just talking about this a few days ago, and he was saying how, you have a system in place which indoctrinates people who will continue and uphold the indoctrination. So, if you ask 99 teachers, if they believe that what they're doing is, in any way kind of, what's the word for the opposite of productive? The opposite of productive, they would say no. They don't know that they have been set out on this, and so you have scientists who have this conditioned protective response because they've been indoctrinated into. I mean, it's the same thing with the medical profession. Anything that looks at, is met with this often, what's the word, a very aggressive response that is like, and Ike talks about it a lot, about how that's part of the system, that the people who put the system in place did that methodically. I mean, it's the same people, the Rockefellers. I mean, the entire medical community was started by them. You have the sciences that were funded by them. They're writing the book, they're writing the rule book, and that's just here in America. So it's like, wait a minute, why should we believe that? But people forget their history, or they never even learn it. Speaking of history.
Yeah, I mean, there is a history, and in Forbidden Archaeology, I kind of get into that a little bit. I have a couple of chapters that deal with the role of foundations and others. If you go back to the early 20th century, like a lot of newspapers, prominent newspapers would publish articles about reincarnation and astrology and different healing modalities, and the scientific community sort of got upset by it. And so there was kind of a meeting held between the owner of the Hearst newspapers and some scientists, and they decided we have to fix this.
Wow.
So they created an association, which still exists, of science writers. And they trained a whole generation of newspaper writers to get proper information from science and, present the party line, you could say.
Right.
And it was very successful. And to this day, they more or less control the content of a lot of the newspapers, which have now gone digital and everything.
Right.
But the same basic idea is there. As far as the foundations go, like the Rockefeller Foundation, they were funding a lot of work. They were funding research into cosmology. They were funding research into Freudian psychology. They were funding genetic research. They were
lots of genetic, yeah.
They were funding, where they would use fruit flies and other things to explore genetics.
That's right, yeah.
And the the president of the Rockefeller Foundation at the time said, well, it looks like we're just, spending money here, spending money there, but it's actually a whole program.
Mm-hmm.
And the program is that we want to be able to control human behavior for beneficial purposes. To benefit who would be my question.
Right.
But, they said everything. We have to understand genetics because we have to understand the basis of what an organism is. We have to study psychology because we've got to figure out the mental aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to study fundamental physics because we're made of atoms and we have to understand it. And like you say, medicine, they got into that, got all the herbal remedies, natural remedies out of medicine.
They sure did.
And, it's like, but they were very open about it. Now,
now it's a big secret. Now you tell people and they don't believe you. And I'm like, what, dude, there was a time when it was on the front page that the Rockefellers and the Mellons have spent $11 million on their eugenics program. I'm like, it wasn't hiding, they were concerned about the quote lower classes, which at the time meant, the poorest and the darkest skinned people. That is a fact. You can read the newspapers in the New York Times. You know what I'm saying? We brought eugenics to Germany. People are like, oh, well, it wasn't Hitler's idea. Hitler admired these people. He admired the industrialists like Henry Ford, like the Rockefeller, these people, the Rothschilds, the Winston Churchill. All these people were they were big, and they were big fans of Hitler until they were told not to be anymore. But that's a different podcast, that rant. But but you know what I'm saying? It's like people don't realize that things were stated much more. There was less reason for them to use subterfuge back then because most people didn't really. The opinions hadn't been formed. Eugenics hadn't got the terrible name that it got in World War II yet, so they could put it on the front page. They were saying they were interested in, quote, improving the gene pool. Now you got to be careful. You can't just say that. Back then you could. Anyway, let's go back to some more conventional. I don't want to say conventional, but let's talk about some of the evidence and what why it should be regarded as valid. Because it's like, why are we've been talking about why some things are obviously given the stamp of approval and others are being scrutinized and, quote, debunked and questioned. But what I would love to get into a little bit with you is some of the biggest kind of like, how can they possibly ignore this, and kind of who has come to your some of the most respected people who have kind of come and said, okay, we should really look at this, the, quote, credentialed people who have come and got your back with this.
Well, that's very interesting. It's like you were saying a little bit earlier that, the people who are part of the system, they don't think they're doing anything wrong. So the scientists involved in human origins and antiquity, especially the archaeologists, they don't think that they're hiding anything, or if some discovery comes to their attention that really doesn't fit, say, well, something's got to be wrong with it. I might not be able to figure it out myself, but I'm sure if I took it to my colleague down the hall or sent it to Professor so-and-so at Yale University, he'd be able to figure it out. So let's just put it aside for the moment.
Right.
Yeah, they just think that we're just being responsible scientists. We're not hiding anything. We're not
Right.
involved in any conspiracy. But the result is the same.
That's right.
Yeah,
Unfortunately. Yeah.
we don't get all the evidence that I mean, whether they think they're filtering things out or not, they're doing it. But just to show you how this operates, I'll give a fairly recent example.
Sure.
A couple of years ago, some archaeologists were digging at Olduvai Gorge, which is a pretty famous site in East Africa. And many discoveries had been made there, but they made a discovery. At first, it doesn't really seem so significant. They found a finger bone. Actually, it's like this one here, like it's called the proximal phalanx of the fifth digit. It's like this bone here. And they found it in layers of rock 1,800,000 years old. So they took it and they carefully measured it. Not just one measurement, but a whole about 30 different measurements. And then they compared those measurements to the measurements of the same bone in Australopithecus, which is one of the supposed human ancestors, Homo habilis, and different species of apes and monkeys, like gorillas and chimpanzees and baboons. And then they also compared it with the anatomically modern human bone. And they found it matched the modern human sample. And it was different from any of the fossil hominids like Australopithecus. It was different from any ape or monkey. It felt squarely right in the human group, according to their analysis. They've got very sophisticated ways of analyzing these things, multivariate statistical analysis, running it through their algorithms and computers. And it came out human. But in their report, they said, although this bone is most like anatomically modern Homo sapiens, we can't call it Homo sapiens because of the age of the geological formation in which it was found. And they just say that.
Yeah.
Like, perfectly normal, nothing going on here, no knowledge filtering.
What can you say?
I'm looking at that and I think, why the hell can't you call it? You study it, you found it in layers of rock 1,800,000 years old. You study it, it's different from any other hominid, it's different from any other ape or monkey. It falls squarely in the human. If a human had died then and left that bone, that's exactly what you'd expect to find. What's the problem?
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, they might say, well, it's possible there could have been some kind of ape man, not human, but, like an Australopithecus, who just did happen, even though it's never been found before, have a finger bone exactly like a modern human finger bone. That's pretty weak.
Right.
I think. So
what's another one that is, kind of, I mean, a little recent, but that is kind of falls into the same.
Well, the Laetoli footprints, which are found in basically the same area of East Africa and Tanzania. That was in 1979. Mary Leakey found dozens of footprints. And in her original report, she said they're found in layers of rock about 3,700,000 years old. In other words, almost 4 million years.
Wow.
And she said in her original report, which was published in National Geographic, these are indistinguishable from anatomically modern human footprints.
Wow.
And other scientists also agreed. There was this paleontologist, Tim White, he said, no doubt about it, these are exactly like modern human footprints. They're just like the footprints we would make if we were, you're walking on a beach and in the sand, you make some footprints. So
Wow.
they, so how do they explain them? I said, well, there must have been some variety of Australopithecus who had feet exactly like modern human feet. And that's how the footprints were made, even though no such creature had actually been discovered. The only creature actually known to science by actual physical evidence that has a foot exactly like a modern human foot is a human being like us.
Right. Right.
So,
wow.
And then there was a couple of years ago a case from England at a place called Happisburgh, which is on the coast of England. Some archaeologists found footprints, this time in layers of rock 700,000 years old. And they carefully studied them, measured them, everything. And they compared the data to different populations of humans and other species. And they found the foot pretty much matched the feet of existing populations of Eskimos.
Oh, wow.
Anatomically modern humans and some Native American Indian tribal people. So
that makes sense. Yeah.
Again, they decided, these were found like I said, in layers of rock, between 700 and 800,000 years old. So they decided, who made these? Well, couldn't be humans like us because we didn't exist until.
What did they
later.
say?
Well, they said, well, who was around in Europe at that time? So there is some ape man, some hominid called Homo heidelbergensis.
Oh, they made one up.
No,
was it a new one, or did they
that it was originally discovered in the early 20th century. It was a very thick jaw, lower jaw. They consider it to be a variety of Homo erectus, which is one of their hominins, one of their so-called human ancestors. So they said, okay, we'll just attribute it to that species. But again, the evidence is kind of like staring them in the face. 800,000 years old, exactly like modern human footprints, not like anything else.
Unbelievable.
What's the problem?
And specifically, the fact that they were more akin to modern Eskimos and our indigenous or Native American footprints, even getting that specific, that you'd think that would help the case, be like, okay, well, let's maybe someone, but they don't, of course, they don't want to do that. They're not interested in rewriting the narrative, because the narrative's in place for more than one reason. And science is just, one of the many, and it's not even a top priority. They've been doing this for so long. They've gotten really good at it, and I think it started it, not uh, ironically, but not surprisingly, it started with Darwin and what they took with his kind of third edition, I think. And then they started bullying their way into the belief systems of humanity with this notion. It reminds me actually of, I was watching this old documentary on the JFK assassination, and you had that one guy, that old guy, you probably remember, but as well as I do, he was the one who he had a very strong Texas, Dallas accent, and he was right there. He was a key witness, and he kept telling him, there's an interview with Mark Lane when he's like, I heard the he's like, I heard the shot, I heard it come from right there, and he said that I was right by that knoll. And he goes through his whole story, and he talks about how, now I know it couldn't be because I know I heard it. And then at the end he says, but I also know I was wrong now because they told me that the shots only came from the depository. So he spent 10 minutes in great detail talking about what he saw and heard, and then said, but I know I was wrong now because they told me that there was only one shooter, and it wasn't, and I'm like, dude, how did you get convinced out of your own eyes and ears and what you were literally experiencing right then and there? That's what they do. And then they say it's science,
Yeah. Well, let's go back to Darwin's time.
Okay.
Yeah, when The Origin of Species came out, although Darwin didn't directly get into this in that book, but scientists who accepted his basic theory of evolution, that one being transforms into another, they immediately began thinking about, well, humans must have come from some ape-like creatures, not exactly like today's apes, but some ancient apes. That's where we must have come from. So scientists began looking for evidence. They began looking for evidence of a creature that's intermediate between the ancient apes and modern humans. They call it missing link.
Right.
Kind of in popular terminology. But they began looking. There wasn't any fixed timeline, but they started looking, and they weren't finding a missing link. They were finding evidence that humans like us existed a long, long time ago, millions of years. So, and these discoveries were reported in scientific journals, at scientific conferences. And this kind of went on through the Origin of Species was published in 1859. So throughout the 1860s, the 1870s, the 1880s, all these discoveries showing a very ancient scientific presence were being discussed in the scientific world. In the early 1890s, a Dutch researcher named Eugene Dubois went to Java, which was part of Indonesia, which was the Dutch colony at the time. So that's how he was able to go there. And he was a medical doctor, but he was interested in human origins. So in his spare time, he would do archaeological investigations, dig trenches, find fossils. So at a place called Trinil in Java, he found a skull cap, the top part of the skull with some very thick brow ridges on it. And then he found about 50 feet away in the excavation a femur or a thigh bone, which looked kind of human. And he kind of put this ape-like skull cap and sort of human-like thigh bone together and said, okay, now I've got it. The Java ape man, Pithecanthropus erectus, he called it. And he announced it to the scientific world. And this was found in layers of rock about 800,000 years old. So they said, okay, now we've got our missing link. When this became accepted in the scientific world, they said, okay, now we've got our missing link. And it's 800,000 years old. So anything human has to come after that.
Right.
And then it became a problem. Okay, what are we going to do with all this evidence that's accumulated over the past 30 or 40 years, showing that humans like us existed far before that? And said, well, it's gone.
Yeah.
We're not going to talk about that anymore because it just doesn't fit.
Right.
So now they had a timeline. And after that Java man discovery, when anything that looked like human, if it was dated before that, like this case from the finger bone from Africa, they found it. It's human according to our measurements, but 1,800,000 years old, 1,000,000 years older than Java man, can't be true.
Right.
We can't call it human. Or the Laetoli footprints, 3.7 million years old, human, indistinguishable from human footprints, can't be human. It's before Java man. And one kind of contemporary example was the California gold mine discoveries, which were made in the 1860s and 1870s. They came to the attention of the chief government geologist of California, Dr. J.D. Whitney. And, miners had been digging tunnels into the sides of mountains to get at the gold deposits in central California in the Sierra Nevada mountains. So in the tunnels, they were finding human bones, obsidian spear points, stone mortars and pestles, all kinds of evidence for a human presence, and layers of rock that modern geologists tell us are 50 million years old.
Wow.
So Whitney in 1880 published a massive report. It's like a book-length report about these discoveries. It came out from Harvard University. But there was a contemporary of Whitney's, Dr. William Holmes, who worked at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And he said, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of evolution, he wouldn't have published those discoveries, because even with all the evidence he has, he still should have known it can't be true. Because in another place he wrote, it can't be true because it's older than Java man. So that's an example of how this process worked out historically, from the time of Darwin. Since you asked about that.
Yeah, no, it's just mind-blowing to me how the pattern repeats itself. They get their narrative, and then they make things conform to it instead of, but I mean, when the narrative has been established for a specific agenda,
Yeah.
then what happens is everything that comes up that is, that shakes it gets either explained away in ways that are kind of absurd,
Yeah.
or that you have to be kind of dogmatic about. You have to enter the realm of the zealot and the religious type, because how else do you say, well, if he had believed in this theory, he would have never published that. Well, if he believed in God, he would have never done that. Well, you know what I mean? Like, there's something very parallel about those two sentences. Whether he believed in the theory or not, he was publishing the evidence he had. Isn't that what science is about? So it boggles my mind how long this has been going on. This notion of pay no attention to your eyes and ears, like nothing to see here. Carry on. We've already told you what's happening. Like, oh my God, it's crazy.
Well, it's kind of interesting that before they had their timeline, in other words, before they had their narrative, set in concrete.
Yeah.
In the scientific world, they were seriously considering these reports, like from, for example, Dr. Ribeiro, who was the head geologist of Portugal in the 19th century. In the 1860s and 70s, he was finding stone tools exactly like those made by Homo sapiens in layers of rock about 20 million years old in his country of Portugal. And these things were published in the established scientific journals. They were displayed in the museum. They were investigated at major international scientific conferences. But then after he died, and the narrative had been fixed a little bit more, his colleagues in the museum said, well, we can't have this here,
Yeah.
But what they initially did was they just changed the age labels for the artifacts that were on display. They were originally labeled early Miocene, which is about 20 million years ago. And they said, well, maybe we call it 20,000 years instead of 20 million.
Oh my God.
And
just
then
leave off a zero.
I actually went to the museum, and they had, these things aren't displayed anymore. They're in storerooms and everything. But I kind of did some research, went through the storerooms and stuff, and saw the new labels that were written, giving them far younger ages.
Yeah.
And then at a certain point, they decided, the next generation of officials in the museum decided, well, let's just put the whole thing away.
Yeah.
And then if an ordinary person going to the museum would never even suspect that these things are there. Have to be someone like me, who has kind of dug into it and done the research, and I know they're there, so I kind of approached the directors of the museum and said, okay, you've got these things there, they're in your museum, I'd like to see them. So I kind of made an appointment and went to Portugal, went to Lisbon, went to the museum, studied and photographed the artifacts. And I presented a paper about them at a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists. So to me, this stuff is fascinating.
Yeah. No, it's very fascinating. It's amazing to me that what a stranglehold they have. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising to me, but it is a little surprising, because it's like, man, even this aspect of accepted sciences, they want to keep people very confined into what they understand about this reality. And it's like you said, it's all, it's not to get all conspiratorial or conspiracy theoryist, but I mean, then again, if you're listening to this podcast, then you already know that that's where I live anyway.
Well, yeah, I'm
But
not
it's
saying there's no conspiracy,
right.
but sometimes uh, you may have your actual conspirators who more or less know what they're doing,
Right.
but people who are just part of the
That's right.
system, you could say it's just the way they've been trained. It's these are the authorities. I want to be an authority in this field. I'm enrolled. I've gotten
Gone to
my
school. Yeah.
master's. I'm getting my PhD, and it's you
Yep.
learn what's in and what's out.
Yep. And what you're allowed to do if you want to stick around and what you're not. And fortunately, anybody who's made, serious headway into treating and curing cancer will tell you that there are some things that you are not allowed to go forward with. I've talked to and heard a lot of stories about that as well, and people who have come up with incredible different treatments in laboratories, and then they go to patent what they've discovered, really in kind of disbelief that no one had done this before, but excited about the implications of how many people this can help, and only to to get find out that a patent for that exact thing exists and has existed for 20 years, but yet there's nothing like that on the market. And then they go down the hall and they talk to their person in charge of their department, and they say, yeah, that's how it's called something like a defensive patent or something. And that's so that you can't ever do anything with what you just discovered. It's there for a reason. And unfortunately, that's the world that we live in. But I think most people would be shocked to realize the extent of that. But there it is anyway. So how many peoples do you think were living on this earth at one time, and where do you think the variation kind of came from? Do you think it just happened? I mean, obviously it had to have happened naturally, but I mean, there are a lot of theories about how we happened and what our origins are. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on the fact that, I think that obviously you believe, based on a mountain of evidence, that there was more than one kind of human existing on this planet at any given time, and that you can go back, I think millions of years and find that. Tell me some of the theories that you have about how this has gone on, and how many, what did the earth look like 10 million years ago in your mind, as far as a human presence on the planet?
Well, there's different sources of knowledge for that. One thing is what we can find in the record of the rocks. The other thing is what we can find in the records of these ancient civilizations, what they say was going on in the distant past. And there was in Greek times, in the time of the ancient Greeks, there was one Greek prominent person, Democritus, I think it was, went to Egypt, and he had some meetings with the Egyptian priest, and I think it was Thebes, and they were talking about history. And he was asked by the Egyptian priest, how do you see, the past and your people? And he said, well, there was a big devastation, a flood. And then after that, the earth was repopulated. There were two, there's a male and a female, and they repopulated the earth, and then our civilization, our Greek civilization, arose. And the Egyptian priests said to him, well, that's just part of the story, because before the devastation, there were humans, and before that, there was another devastation, and before that, another one, and another one. So there were many civilizations, you know. So
Yeah.
we've got the records that show that, and you've just forgotten it, you know. So I kind of see things like that there have been repeated catastrophes in the long history of the earth. And during the intervening periods, human civilizations have risen and fallen many times. And they have been, some of them, very advanced. You know, in the Puranas, the historical writings of ancient India, there are descriptions of human civilizations on this planet going back millions of years, and they had spacecraft, they had huge cities, very well planned economies, and they had weapons resembling modern nuclear weapons, and they had all kinds of things. So of course, that as I said, is one kind of evidence about the past. Now, what you find in the record of the rocks is going to be more limited, but even there, I mean, you were talking about different kinds of human-like creatures. The Vedic texts say there are 400,000 human-like species or kinds of humans scattered throughout the universe. Of course, that brings in an extraterrestrial element to the whole question. But yeah, when Forbidden Archeology was first published in 1993, at that time in the scientific world, they had a very linear conception of human evolution. Like there was, at any one time, they would have said there's one human species or human ancestral species. Like, 6 or 7 million years ago, Australopithecus. And around 3 million years ago, Homo habilis. About 2 million years ago, it kind of changes into Homo erectus, which turns into the Neanderthals, which turn into humans like us. At that time, they said at about 100,000 years ago. So they had this very linear picture of things. But in Forbidden Archaeology, we kind of showed, using fossil evidence from China and different parts of the world, that a long time ago, millions of years ago, actually there were anatomically modern humans coexisting with types of creatures that are now called ape men or hominids, like Australopithecus and Homo habilis and erectus, like that. And there were also apes and monkeys around, which is, I think that is the actual, if you actually look at all the evidence, what you get is not one thing evolving into other, but parallel coexistence of various types of humans and ape men and apes and monkeys. And I think that's actually true today, that there are humans existing on this planet, there are apes and monkeys existing, and I think there and this takes us into a
Go for it. Let's
political
go far
area.
out. Let's go far out.
Sasquatch, Bigfoot,
Yes.
all that.
Yeah.
So there are still some living examples of ape men present too. So you've got the same coexistence
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
going
not to
on
mention,
today, and the same is true of the past.
makes perfect sense to me, Michael. I would hazard a guess that there's even more underground, that we don't, that we have not been able to take stock of. But I'm sure that, that there are, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of that speaks to the fact that there were civilizations that had gone underground, not just in recent past, but in civilizations past, and that there's a whole ecosystem down there. Now, that's hard to believe for a lot of people. But I know that just recently somebody stumbled through a hole in the ground in China and found a whole forest underground. And they were like, what? And they took pictures of it. So it's like people were shocked, and they continue to find, oceans under oceans, and still they're shocked. But some of us aren't aren't shocked as easily anymore, because we know there's a lot of things that are kind of out of our awareness. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but it's like they don't want to undermine Darwin. It goes back to him, but the reason why is not what people think. It's not because Darwin was so amazing and he's so right. We're not talking about, the earth being, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's comparable to that kind of a paradigm shift, I guess, for people. If everyone believes in evolution, then we try to convince them, that this way of thinking is actually less close to the truth. And everyone starts realizing that we've been around a lot longer, and, consciousness comes into it, then you have a population that's going to be a lot more, bigger thinking than they are.
Yeah. Well, one thing I like to say is that if somebody considers all the evidence and decides that Darwin makes the most sense to them, I don't have any objection to that. Or if somebody listens to what I say and considers it and decides, oh, very interesting, Mr. Cremo, but I'm not convinced.
Yeah.
That is fine with me. Where I think the problem comes in is when somebody uses force,
right,
especially government force, to compel somebody to accept something, where it's no longer a matter of persuasion and
that's kind of what they're doing.
Yeah, I think so. That what's happened is that, at least in this country and in many other countries, that government has given a monopoly to the dominant consensus group of scientists. And everything, once they have that monopoly, then everything else is marginalized and debunked, discredited, and so that is not a very healthy situation for,
it's a shame.
I think, a country that considers itself democratic. There was one philosopher of science, trying to remember his name, but he said, just like there is separation between church and state, there should be separation between science and state.
There should be. But more importantly, there should be separation between money and state. Because if you could separate the money from state, then you wouldn't be able to incentivize the state into only pushing and accepting one form of thought that, or beliefs or knowledge that, goes with what the money benefits from people believing, right?
Yeah.
That's the key. That's, you know, that's why they won't let anyone take the money out of politics. They continue to make more legal reasons why it's okay. And it's not okay. It's screwing up everything, because it allows for a control system that is only in the money's interest. And the government is, you know, more than happy to take the incentive. I mean, it's how they make their money. They're supposed to be public servants. I just found out that the New York City mayor has $3 million worth of property and rental. He was a police captain. They're like, he's one of the most corrupt politicians in New York. I'm like, well, that explains how he became mayor. You know what I mean? Like, if he was a police captain and he made $3 million in New York, New York City cops don't make that much money. You know what I mean? What was he doing? It's corruption. It's corruption. But, you know, I was reading some interesting examples, you know, about like the Clerksdorp spheres, I think they're called.
Yeah.
Remember
I remember them. They're in my book.
That's right. That's right. They were a really cool kind of an example. Can you talk about them for a minute?
Yeah, those are an extreme anomaly. In my book, Forbidden Archeology, most of the book deals with evidence that is reported in scientific publications.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, if evidence for extreme human antiquity is really there, then we might expect it's not only going to be found by scientists and written about by them and their professional literature, but ordinary people are also going to be finding this stuff, and they may write about it in some other publication, mm-hmm. some newspaper or tabloid or something. So in South Africa, I learned that some round metallic objects had been found in a mine there. And what was really interesting about them is some of them were perfectly spherical, and around their equators, there were parallel grooves. You know, they looked like something that had to be manufactured somehow, not like something natural. And the problem is they were found in a mine in mineral deposits about 2.8 billion, not million, but billion years old.
Wow.
So the reports about them came out in Weekly World News, which is kind of a sensationalistic, you know, tabloid publication. But I got in touch with the director of the museum in which some of these objects were kept. And, you know, he sent back some information about them. And we decided to include them in a documentary that was being made for NBC some years ago. And they said, before we can include them in the program, you have to get them analyzed by some independent company of metallurgists.
Mm-hmm.
So we did that. You know, they were submitted to a metallurgy company, and they mm-hmm. analyzed them, and they said they're made of hematite. You know, like hematite is like a kind of naturally occurring iron, or
right.
It's also considered like a semi-precious stone. You can get hematite jewelry and things like that. So they were included in the documentary. And and another thing the metallurgist said, they said we can't really explain how these grooves and then could have occurred naturally, you know, mm-hmm. like, you know, so they were shown on this NBC television special, but you know, it just, I mean, the reaction from scientists was just total outrage. You know, I mean, that of course that wasn't the only thing in in
Right.
the show, there was the work of John Anthony West about the pyramids, Robert Schoch about the Sphinx and its age, Graham Hancock, other
Yeah.
people in the alternative archaeology and history field. And also, I appeared on it as
Yeah.
well. But there was just total outrage from the scientific world. They began to organize boycotts of the sponsors of the
My
program.
God.
They went to the FCC,
Oh my
tried to
God.
get the FCC to censor and fine NBC millions of dollars for having
Are you
shown
serious?
this, make apologies, public apologies. Of course, none of that happened, but
Right. But the fact that they were so outraged is, I
yeah.
mean, oh
Well,
my
because
God.
they had thought we control the media. And
Yeah.
how did this happen? Who let these guys in?
Unbelievable, man. Unbelievable. That is definitely an extreme anomaly. There's a lot of those, I know I'm a fan of Greg Braden, and he writes some great books, and he loves talking about what does he call them? Objects out of time, maybe. And he kind of catalogs all these things that are, he probably pisses a lot of people off with his books and shows too, but he'll show like this. I mean, it's very technologically advanced, and it was found in the ocean, and it's basically, you could see the gears, and this thing is like millions and millions of years old, they did an x-ray of it, and it was, I mean,
Sounds like the antiquity mechanism.
yeah, I think that's what it was. Which is, it's like, how do you ignore something like that? It's just, it's so crazy, this world we live in. What did you think of that? Were you like, wow?
Well, the antiquity mechanism was found in a shipwreck, ancient shipwreck in the Mediterranean, and it was very much corroded. But like you said, they did X-rays and kind of non-invasive,
Yeah.
destructive methods. Because if you tried to scrape all the
No, yeah, you
stuff
would be
off,
destroyed.
wreck it. So, and they kind of figured out from the gears and everything that it was a navigation device, that gave the positions of all the planets and the constellations in the sky. And
Wow.
it was an astronomical instrument, showing very sophisticated astronomical knowledge and technical ability, like to make a mechanism like that. It's just pretty.
What did they
pretty
date that?
amazing.
Do you remember what they dated it to?
It's not millions of years. It's few thousand years.
Oh, okay.
But mostly they think that kind of technology and astronomical knowledge only came, a few centuries ago, not a few thousand years ago.
Right.
So it's
Wow.
pretty amazing discovery. I'm mostly dealing with things far older than that.
Right. Right.
But even that is an anomaly. But to get back to the Klerksdorp spheres, there's a kind of a professional debunker geologist who kind of decided to get into the case, and I mean, he raises some good points, but my basic position is, until somebody can give me an example of a perfectly round spherical object made of hematite, that has all these parallel grooves around it, and show me how it formed naturally.
Right.
All right.
What
but nobody's been able to do that. As a matter of fact, I once went to South Africa and I visited the chief mining engineer from the mine where these things were found. And he showed me a block of the mineral deposit, a block of rock with several of these spheres embedded in the solid rock. Some of them were partially exposed, kind of like raisins in a raisin nut or something. So some of them were partially protruding from the surface of the rock. And I could see they had the grooves on them that went back into the solid rock.
Wow.
You know, like, I mean, because one idea is, okay, maybe you got some round mineral deposits and somebody, you know, carved some lines on it and uses it to fool tourists or something, you know, like.
Yeah. But no, that wouldn't be, it wouldn't show up like that then.
Yeah, you wouldn't see them in the solid rock like that.
Yeah.
But, and then another geologist wrote in an email discussion, said, well, I don't have any samples, but you can find them all over the world. And the reason you don't find any publications about it is we geologists don't think they're interesting enough to even comment on. So,
oh my God.
But I wrote back to him and said, okay, I understand you're not interested, but I am. And you've said something about this. You said you can find these things anywhere. So show me.
Go ahead and find me one, please. Yeah.
A photograph of one, a perfectly round spherical object with, you know, the parallel grooves on, and explain to me exactly how it formed naturally. He says, well, I can't do that.
You just said you could. Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, it's, you know, so often you're met with those kind of responses. Like everybody knows that. Anybody would think that. And like, okay, so just provide me with one example then. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, you go from everyone to nobody, from, so endless supply to, okay, so they don't exist.
Well, it's like kind of keeps you on your toes.
Yeah. I hear you.
Because I think people do have a right to ask for confirmation or give
absolutely
contradictory evidence. And
sure.
I mean,
no, absolutely. And they should, and it should be kind of part of, it should be part of the whole process, you know, and it is in a lot of ways, but unfortunately it's, you know, there are some things that are not accepted no matter what. And so the system is biased, but what an incredible body of work you have, Michael. It's fascinating to me, and there's so much more we could talk about, but we're a little low on time. You know, I want to just kind of wrap it up with what is like the most exciting thing that you have come across in the last few years that really got you, you know, kind of excited again and talking about finding yourself talking about some of these things, probably with some of the same people, but is there anything that happened in the last few years that really kind of caught your interest?
I mean, it sounds like a small thing, but that example of the finger bone from South Africa, you know, it just kind of confirmed to me that, this process of knowledge filtration, it's ongoing. I mean, it's just like a perfect example of what I'm talking about. But
you know why else it's a perfect example? Because it's recent enough where they could test it every which way with every kind of technological advancement we've made, and you know damn well that they were testing it, trying to prove that it was part of the narrative, and they were unable to do that. So that makes it even more meaningful, I think.
Yeah. But another thing I'm going to say is, to me, the most impressive thing isn't, one particular case. To me, the most impressive and astonishing thing is that there's so much of this.
Mm.
We're not just talking about one or two cases of some anomalies.
Yeah.
We're talking about a whole systematic knowledge filtering process that's resulted in very good scientific evidence being put aside for reasons that don't seem very good, in order to keep the current narrative in place. So to me, that the most fascinating thing is, as I said, not any one particular discovery, but the whole mass of evidence that we're talking
the mountain
about.
Of it. I forgot to ask you. I got into a big debate with one of my friends who does a show with me. He's a hardcore skeptic, and I try to tell him that there's a ton of documentation about a lot of bones that were found, particularly, between the years 1880 and I want to say like 1920 in America, that were, being at least initially gauged as bones of humans, but extraordinarily large humans, and that there was, a lot of these. They were almost like hills and like piles of them being found, and apparently there was, I read a lot of newspaper articles when they were finding them, and they were supposedly brought to the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian at one point said they lost them. And my friend's like, this is all made up, it's all bullshit, they just made a mistake, they were never giant bones. And I was wondering what you had learned about it in your studies.
Well, yeah, I accept that large-sized humans existed in the past.
Yeah.
And when I say large size, I mean 9 feet or over, because we have a lot of living humans who are 7 feet tall, and that's basketball teams.
Yeah.
And there's even one or two cases of people, 8 feet tall. I think there's a man in Mongolia, I think that's 8 feet some inches tall.
Yeah.
But we don't find anybody, 10 feet tall or 9 feet tall. So
like you mean like they did find in some of those bones?
Well, yeah. I mean, some of the discoveries that are called giants are within the modern human range.
Right.
7 feet tall, things like that. Of course, if they have jaws with double rows of teeth and stuff like that,
right,
that kind of that's a different story. But the difficulty is trying to locate any of these bones today of the very large size human remains. Those are, because I've looked. I mean, I accept that giants existed in the past, and it's even part of ordinary science that before 5,000 or 10,000 years ago, most animals and even plants were bigger than they are today. I kind of live in California. There's the California redwood trees, which some of which are thousands of years old, and I think they're kind of holdovers from that previous age when things were bigger, when the elephants were bigger, the bears were bigger, the
sloths were bigger,
everything was bigger.
Everything was bigger.
So
that's cool.
It wouldn't be surprising to me to find that humans were bigger as well. So at least some of them. That's really cool. The most well-documented case, from a scientific point of view, that I've encountered was the Castelnau discoveries from southern France. It's a place called Castelnaw. I pronounce it Castle now. I don't know if that's
Right.
French pronunciation or not. But there, in the late 19th century, a French archaeologist named Dr. Lapouge found large-size human bones, not complete skeletons, but like a humerus, which is the upper arm bone, and a femur, which is the thigh bone. And if you have a femur, a thigh bone of a certain size, you can calculate how tall
Absolutely.
the human being was that had it. And apparently, like with a thigh bone of the size of the one that was found, the human would have been 11 feet tall.
Wow.
And there are photographs of this, in a scientific journal, photographs of the bones, the report by Dr. Lapouge. So
cool.
I think that those bones must be in some museum in France somewhere. So if they could be tracked down, I think that's one of the best cases.
Yeah, I'm going to look into it.
Because like you were pointing out, there's a lot of reports in newspapers, and there are reports that institutions like the Smithsonian Institution have had these in their collections. But if you try to locate them today, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
So that's the problem as I see it. I accept they existed. The reports are very persuasive, but I would like to see at least at least one skeletal remain that is indisputably human, and that is from a human that is, as I said, at least 9 or 10, 11 feet tall.
Something that can't be kind of grouped in or written off as just it could
that they found a mastodon femur and they thought it was human.
Right.
It was a giant. That's the usual kind of explanation.
Yeah.
Because there are people who have written about the history of fossil hunting. The Greeks and the Romans would find fossils, like a mastodon or something.
And it's a cyclops bone. Yeah, that's probably where a lot of myths came from. But Michael, I'm so grateful for your time. Listen, I know there's a very fascinating and spiritual side of your work, and some of the expeditions you'd made, to Cambodia and some of your travels and what you've seen. And of course, that's part of the reason why you got into this work. I would love to have you back on one day to talk about that part.
That would be fine. Cool. I think my publicist assistant, Lori.
Yes, I do.
Set it up with her.
Okay, I will, Michael. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And I'll shoot you guys an email and let you know when this is going to come out in case you want to catch it.
Okay, great.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael. Great talking to you.
Okay, Faust.
Take care.